The Arab Spring, a series of revolutions that spread across the Arab world, is reaching its 10th year, depending on whether you believe it is still continuing as a process. A single act of immolation from a desperate vegetable seller in Tunisia set the region alight. The fall of Ben Ali, followed by Mubarak and others, was hailed as a truly epochal moment in world history. But like all historical shifts, this was not going to be easy, and early optimism made way for a deep realism and scepticism as the autocrats mounted their own counter-coup, and international actors concluded that the old Cold War rationale to turn a blind eye to tyrants in exchange for stability re-emerged as the doctrine that guided Western capitals, even when their public rhetoric suggested otherwise. If Syria stands as a lesson, it is that once a conflict turns into a military struggle, the opposition loses control over the narrative. Certainly no one at the time would have estimated just how bloody the civil war would become, but the inclusion of regional and international actors into the bloody mix made it impossible for anyone but Assad to succeed. We at The Thinking Muslim are using this milestone to evaluate these past 10 difficult years. We have interviewed two guests that broadly reflect the concerns of Islamic groups, but who have digested the sober reality. And if you haven't, I would very much suggest you listen to both Dr. Azam Tamimi and Dr. Uthman Bakash. Both in their own way argued that the Islamic project became too exclusive and a broad platform was not created. Instead, more parochial partisan concerns took over. This episode, I speak at length to the Arab Spring activist Iyad El-Baghdadi about his valuable experience, analysis and forecast. He rose to prominence in the aftermath of the Arab revolutions of 2011 before being summarily arrested and forcibly exiled from his home in the UAE in April 2014. Today he is recognized amongst the most influential and prominent Arab voices online. He lives in Oslo, Norway, where he has been granted political asylum and writes regularly for both Norwegian and international media. He is also founder and editor-in-chief of the Arab Tyrant Manual, a platform for the study of authoritarian behavior and tactics. Iyad's perspective is critical if we are to learn the lessons from the past decade. Certainly his views may differ from my previous two guests, but his analysis is as important for thinkers and activists. I would add, if the Muslim Ummah is to find a way forward, then we have to as much as possible learn to build as broad a platform and develop ways to accommodate viewpoints, a philosophy badly lacking and a contributing factor to the decline, albeit temporarily, of the past decade. We too easily label people who do not agree with us, cast in broad categories of Islamist or liberal as an excuse to dismiss one another. Yet behind these labels there is nuance. I found Brother Iyad to have a deep concern for the region and the Ummah at large. I would advise all listeners to listen to the end, where he directly tackles the role of Islam and ideology. Well, Brother Iyad El-Baghdadi, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to the Thinking Muslim podcast.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah, Jalal. How are you doing?
Yeah, good, thank you. And how are you today?
Alhamdulillah.
And you're in Oslo, right? You're currently residing in Oslo. What brought you to Oslo, Iyad?
Well, it was quite a long and complicated story, but in 2014, I was arrested in my former country, the United Arab Emirates, where I used to live. And being Palestinian, of course, when they want to expel you, there was an order for my expulsion, which came from higher powers. That's all I was told. I was not really told. I was not really charged with anything, and I was not really told who wanted me out and why. But there was an order for my arrest and my expulsion, and because there was nowhere, I'm Palestinian, and there's nowhere to send me back to. As a result, I was sent to prison, and eventually managed to convince the prison authorities to send me to Malaysia, where I lived in the airport for a month, not being able to enter Malaysia, not being able to leave anywhere else. Complicated story, but eventually I managed to come to Norway. I was invited to speak at a human rights conference, and it just happened that I was actually invited to this conference before I was arrested. um, the conference actually took place, or it was scheduled to take place at the same time that I was in prison. But luckily for me, there was a strike. There was a hotel strike in Norway, in Oslo, and as a result, the conference was shifted, and that gave me enough time to kind of be able to schedule myself in such a way that I was able to get out of prison, get out of the airport, go to Malaysia, get the proper paperwork, and then eventually come to Norway as a guest. And eventually, after that, I applied for asylum, got my family, the rest of my family, out of the United Arab Emirates. And here I am now. I live. This is where I live now, and I guess it's not the worst place to live, given all the options.
And you were arrested, Brother Iyad, because of your activism, and I suppose more specifically your online activities in relation to the Egyptian revolution at that time. Can you tell us a little bit more? Did they explain the grounds for your arrest?
What I was literally told, I mean, of course, that is correct, but they would never actually tell you the reason. They consider it to be almost, I mean, literally what they literally told me is that you should figure out what you did. But it was clear that, I had kind of a tense relationship with them. I actually received my first warning shortly after Mubarak was ousted. Kind of like a reminder that you should know that there's a roof, there's a ceiling to free expression in this country. And looking back at those years between 2011 and 2014, I was quite. I don't want to use the word reckless, but kind of I pushed my limit. I kind of prioritized. I prioritized free expression and really speaking out my mind. And when I was in prison, it was a tough situation because the options in front of me were very bleak. It was either, I had a refugees travel document that was issued by Egypt. And had I been sent back to Egypt by the UAE's authorities, I would have been disappeared. I would have been tortured to death in one of Sisi's dungeons. And nobody would have even heard about me, heard of what happened to me after that. I probably disappeared. The other option, of course, would be that the UAE would think of a reason to put me in prison, like try to justify why I'm in prison. And eventually they'll charge me with a crime, and then I'd be in prison for 10 years or so. So given all of the options, I guess expulsion was kind of the least worst option.
But let's talk about the Arab Spring. I mean, many say that the Arab Spring is now over, and the optimism that fell in 2011 and throughout the early period of that decade has been replaced with a deep pessimism. Now, you've written that the region remains a tinderbox and the frustrations haven't gone away. What is your proof of this?
Well, I tend to look at the Arab Spring not really as an event that happened in 2011. I mean, in your initial question, you were asking basically, what do you think? Do you think it's succeeded or failed? But I think another question could be, what is the Arab Spring? How do you define it? And I tend not to look at it really as an event in 2011, but rather as a phase, as an intergenerational transition that started in 2011. I really look at this as a 30-year process, as a life, basically the lifespan of a generation. And we're 10 years into a 30-year process. Early in such transitions, there's always this feeling of inevitability. There's a feeling that our victory is very near, and there's a sense that we're unstoppable. This is something that happened not only with the Arab Spring, but this is recorded across uprisings. The thing about intergenerational transitions, especially democratic transitions where people who had no political agency come to gain political agency, these things take time. They rarely ever happen overnight. A lot of the observers, especially the Western observers, looking at the Arab Spring, by the way, so like the whole thing starts in December 2010 in Tunisia. And it continues through Egypt, Yemen, Libya, Syria. there's like out of 22 Arab countries, there are 20 countries that had uprisings over that period. It was in July of 2011, very, very close to the beginning, that a panel on BBC was put together, and they actually contacted me, and they're like, we want to put together a panel about the failure of the Arab Spring. So it was July. Imagine that. In July 2011, they were already speaking about the failure of the Arab Spring. And that kind of prompted me to think, what is it about Western observers of the Arab Spring that made them think that this is a matter of a few weeks? Right now, what I think is that their model for a democratic transition was really 1989. They were looking at the collapse of the Soviet Union and how a lot of Eastern Europe kind of really flipped into the Western model at the time, which is not only democracy but also capitalism. At the time, of course, it seemed like a flip of a switch. All of a sudden, all of these countries that were communist for a very long time suddenly, joined the rest of Europe. And I believe that was a very blinkered view. They so I mean, there's several reasons why this is so. I think one of the most important reasons really is that in 1989, with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Western model had come out on top. It was kind of reigning supreme, right? So, like, the opposite of the USSR was, the so-called liberal world order. Democracy, capitalism, free markets, etc. So, for a lot of people in Eastern Europe, it was kind of clear what the option was. What was the like, now that we're not communist, what are we going to be? It was kind of obvious. We're going to be the guys who won, which is, the Western Bloc. This was not at all clear in 2011. In 2011, like, the Western model was, creating crisis after crisis. I mean, we had just emerged from the 2008 Great Recession, right? The financial crash, and there were like, really worrying signs about where this model is going in the first place. That was just one. Although, I mean, we can discuss the other reasons, but this is just one reason. But I think that the whole thing is that they underestimated how easy or how difficult it is for such an enormous geopolitical shift to take place. Because keep in mind, the Arab world, I mean, even if we speak beyond the Arab world, we're speaking about the MENA region, Middle East of North Africa. You're talking about a block of maybe 25, 26 countries, depending on how you count it, because this is it's a fluid definition, really. But you're really talking about almost 700 million people. That's more than the population of the United States and more than the population of the European Union. It's a large block of people. If such a large area and a large block of people gain political legitimacy, gain political agency, really for the first time in history, in many cases, this is an enormous geopolitical event, and it's going to be pushing against very deeply entrenched political and geopolitical forces that benefit from the fact that this region does not have political agency. And so this is not something that can happen in a year or two, or even I believe not even in a decade or two. It's going to take. This is a great shift. So I think that a lot of the observers really did not appreciate that this is not going to be easy. And especially Europeans, they forgot what Europe's transition to democracy looked like. Like, Europe's transition to democracy was 2 world wars and 100 million people dead. And even then, it was not complete. You can argue that it's really completed, after the fall of the Soviet Union. And even now, you have like an uprising in Belarus, for example. That's also a European country. So I think that the whole idea about success or failure and reducing it to only 2011 is inaccurate. It's also unfair. But going back to the whole point of that resentments continue to be. I mean, you can see that even though we had a reversal in 2013, 2014 with the rise of the counter-revolutionary axis, spearheaded by the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, who decided that they're not going to allow a democratic transition in the region, and they're going to fight against it and with everything they could. Especially, of course, the first strike was in Egypt, because Egypt is such an important country. It's like 100 million people. And Egypt is that one country that if you have a successful transition away from dictatorship in Egypt, it's going to change the region.
That's an interesting point you make. So the failure in the world system was exploited by these actors. But I wonder to what extent did the United States predict that, and did the United States allow this vacuum to open up in the Middle East, which effectively led to chaos and anarchy?
The world order itself was in a very bad shape even before the Arab Spring. I believe the order has been hypocritical for a very long time. It kind of preached the idea that this is a free world and this is a liberal world order, etc., while actually it was an extremely hypocritical world order. It was freedom and justice for some. And we were always excluded. And so, I mean, between 2015, 2016, with the rise of the right-wing nationalism wave, first with the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, and then with the rise of Trump and everything that came with Trump, because Trump was also, he had a lot of allies across the world, including the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and Israel, and other, and Putin and other forces that wanted to use him kind of as a hammer to smash this order, and also to give them to help them implement a certain agenda that they exploited.
You make a very interesting point about the world order. Can I ask you to unpick that for a second? If the Arab Spring was not looking towards Western models, then where was the Arab Spring in its initial stages pointing in terms of ideas and political values?
It wasn't only the Arab Spring that suffered. The entire world order started to break apart, and this had, I believe that the breakage of the world order, the world already had some real intrinsic problems. It had real contradictions that had to be resolved one way or the other. And I believe that the fabric of this world order really started to rip. It had to rip somewhere, and it started to rip, I believe, in Syria. With the rise of, with the extreme brutality of Assad, with the failure of the world to take any action, a world order that preached justice and equality and freedom, etc., just sat there and watched the slaughter in Syria. And of course, eventually, when we had ISIS, suddenly they wanted to intervene. We don't have to go over the details of what happened after that. Of course, it was an enormous tragedy in Syria. But then on the heel of that, you have this rise of Russia, of Putin. Of course, he exploited this whole situation. We had also the rise in Saudi Arabia of Mohammed bin Salman. And then we had the rise of this right-wing wave, which was sweeping across European nations themselves. But then, despite all of that, you had 2018, 2019 come along, and then you had another wave of uprisings in the Middle East of North Africa. You had an uprising in Sudan, in Algeria. You had renewed protests in Egypt. You had an uprising in Lebanon. You had an uprising in Iraq. And you actually had even continuing protests in Syria and also in Gaza, in Palestine. And so as the second wave has already come, and it actually resulted in the change of government in Sudan and Algeria. And, Algeria and Sudan are kind of in transition right now. And you had kind of incomplete uprisings in Lebanon and Iraq because, eventually it was the pandemic that kind of forced a stop to the protest wave. So, when I say it's not over, I'm really simply stating the facts. The fact is that every problem that we had that led to the Arab Spring kicking off in 2010, 2011, it got only worse by 2020. So the trends have not actually, there's nothing in the system that made it more sustainable. In fact, it's actually become more unsustainable. The ruling elites have become even more detached from the will of from the consent of the population. They've become even more tyrannical, and they, in many cases, they're actually trying very hard to find a source of legitimacy which is even more separated from their own people. And so, I mean, like I say, I mean, it's going to continue to be, you look at the region and you see the following. You see some countries which have authoritarian consolidation. Some countries have democratic transitions. Some countries have proxy wars. You have refugee waves, terror waves. You have certain countries which are in stagnation, you have some countries which are in popular uprising. So it's as if the whole region is boiling over with some places being showing resilience and resistance, and some places showing stagnation and authoritarian consolidation. And what I argue a lot is that this is going to be with us for a while. This is what a democratic transition actually looks like. It looks like a lot of instability. It's not an orderly affair, and it's not a linear affair either.
That's really interesting, except you, and you alluded to it in your answer, that the international community have almost concluded, it seems to me, at least when it comes to America and most of Europe, that the idealism that they initially had when they supported the Arab Spring has now made way for a realism and an acceptance of the strong men in government, and not only an acceptance, but a tacit and an explicit support for these strong men. And I suppose my question is, to what extent can people power, public discontent, compete with an international community that has consolidated and preserves and gives approval to regimes that are ready to engage in the most barbarous acts of repression in order to keep the status quo as it is?
Well, let me go back first and really scan the international reaction to the Arab Spring. To first, I mean, to set up the answer, I want to really emphasize the fact that the entire region, almost the entire region, has been colonized, especially by two Western nations, the United Kingdom and France. This was, of course, before in the first half of the decolonization, or what do you say? The end of formal colonialism really happened after the Second World War, mostly after the Second World War. And of course, these were, in the experience of the people of the region with colonialism kind of varied from country to country. So, of course, for example, in Algeria, it was much more repressive than, let's say, in other parts of the region, like, for example, the United Arab Emirates and the Gulf states, which were kind of British protectorates, but there wasn't this kind of settler colonialism there. So the experience kind of with colonialism varied, but the one thing that was perhaps the most damaging about colonialism really is not just a matter of occupation. The colonialist doesn't just come to your country and take it over and exploits its natural resources and exploits its people. There's also the colonial narrative, and the colonial narrative, what it says is, not only are we in charge, but you are not good enough to run your own affairs, and this is why we have to run your affairs for you. And if you go back and see the narratives that were employed at the time, I mean, when the people of our region asked for independence, what they were being told were, you are not ready for self-rule. They were literally being told that you cannot govern yourself. You are not good enough to govern yourself. You are not good enough to have any kind of political agency. And I kind of relate that. Of course, eventually, after the Second World War, it was obvious that the colonizing nations, the France, and then Italy, for example, had colonies itself. It had colonized Libya, and parts of the Horns of Africa. These Western nations. I mean, if perhaps the most jarring part about colonialism is that France and the United Kingdom, at the time that they were colonizing this region, were actually democratic nations at home. And this is part of the racist narrative of colonialism. Colonialism is essentially racist because it's saying we deserve self-rule, we get to rule ourselves, we get political agency, but you don't. You're not ready for it. You have to basically jump through hoops and become more like us before we can give you political agency. So this was the colonial narrative, and like I said, after the Second World War, these countries are, of course, really bankrupted by the Second World War, and they could not really afford to keep the colonies. So that kind of played in to. I mean, I don't think that they would have given up the colonies had there not been a Second World War. But eventually, there was a wave of decolonization, but we had the rise of something else. We had the rise of what I call neocolonialism. And under neocolonialism, it's not so much that they are directly ruling you, but they are so they're still employing the same narrative, but instead of saying you are not ready for self-rule, they're saying you're not ready for democracy. And instead of ruling you directly, they are selling weapons, and they're selling, they're giving all kinds of support to your dictator. So instead of the old colonial narrative, which is that we rule you and you don't get to rule yourself, you have neocolonialism, which is basically, maybe we don't rule you directly, but we support your dictator, and your dictator is the one who says you're not ready for democracy, and we're fine with that. So this is basically just setting the stage, so that before I get into how did the world react when 2011 happened. They were reluctant. I mean, it wasn't exactly that they immediately were supportive of the Arab Spring. In fact, if you look at the early reaction from the U.S. State Department, from the United Kingdom, from France, etc., to the uprisings, it was actually confusion because nobody predicted it. Nobody actually knew that this was going to happen. And initially, they were like, "How are we going to react? Are we going to stand by?" Mubarak was a very important ally of the West. Ben Ali was a very important ally of the West. So, so how do we react here? And it was really only because events, proceeded so fast, and Ben Ali basically was gone, before the end of January, and then, Mubarak was gone before the middle of February. Events happened so fast that a lot of these Western nations had to change their course. They were forced to change their course because of the speed of the events. And you're right, by 2012, 2013, this kind of cynicism kind of crept back in. Honestly, I don't think it's only cynicism. Honestly, I think there's a big dose of racism in there, because suddenly, basically, we have to be perfect. We have to be picture perfect. We have to transition to democracy within a few weeks, and we have to look exactly like what they want us to be. Otherwise, we're not worth, standing up for. But then again, I mean, the thing is, I mean, I can be a little bit cynical about the Western role over here, but I think it's also that the foreign policy for a lot of countries is really complicated. It's complicated by precedent, by previous relationships, by intersecting alliances, by shifting priorities, etc. And I think for that reason, sometimes it kind of trends towards the most safe, the kind of like they play safe and they play cynical, really. And there was, between 2013, especially between 2013 and 2014, it seemed like nobody had any leverage over these dictators. Especially, I'm talking, of course, the dictators that led the assault against the Arab Spring, which are led basically by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. I guess the United States could have stopped them. This was the Obama administration. Of course, Obama was very interested at the time in kind of having a kind of improved relationships, opening up relationships with Iran, etc. He was looking at a different future for the relationship between the United States and the region. He wanted to kind of like, the United States basically is kind of sickened. I mean, a lot of the population of the United States, I'm not talking about the politicians there, but a lot of the population of the United States are really sick and tired of the endless wars that the United States has been involved in for a very long time. And they simply they want out. They don't want America to be involved in wars and, either for good or bad in this region. This is going to continue to be the case. I think whether it's Obama, whether it's Trump, whether it's, whoever comes after Trump, it's still going to be the same case, that America is going to be retreating. And this, of course, opens a door. Whenever a big actor pulls out, it opens a vacuum. And of course, this vacuum has been exploited by certain dictatorships, but also by Russia, also by terror groups, and also, of course, by the Iranian regime and its proxies and militias. So it's been an extremely chaotic period of time. and I don't blame anyone for being confused about what's happening, which is why it's always important to go back to fundamentals and go back to centering your own people. Because in the end, I mean, maybe this comes to your answer about is people power enough? Look, the only thing that can change the world order is if the people who are excluded, who have been systematically excluded by the world order, gather enough power so that so that they cannot be ignored anymore. For that reason, you don't need only people on the streets. You need a consistency of effort. In other words, you need to be pushing together. You need to create coalitions which are as big as possible, that push together towards political agency.
I want to understand the current role of the dictators in the Arab and Muslim world in general. Now, you're right in arguing that there was confusion in Western capitals, and for a period of time there was some support, and that support was reined back when they saw the potential impact of that support. But it seems now that it's settled in Western capitals that the dictators are here to stay, and you're right. You know, it probably comes from a colonial attitude that it's impossible for them to govern themselves, and so it's better that we continue the Cold War strategy of just emboldening the strong men, because at least they can keep some level of stability over this population. But I wonder to what extent was much of that informed by the threat of Islamic parties coming to power. I mean, Shadi Hamid talks a lot about this, that if you allow for free and fair elections in any of the Arab countries, the likelihood is that the population will support one Islamic group or another, and that probably will lead to a Muslim Brotherhood type of government, as we saw in Egypt. And I wondered to what extent did the Americans come to, and especially the Obama administration, come to the conclusion that in weighing up the dictators versus Islamic government, the dictators would probably serve their interests much more than a Muslim Brotherhood-led government.
So let me start with whether European countries, Western countries in general, Western governments in general, kind of supported the dictators after 2013, or whether it was more born out of cynicism. Look, it's definitely the case that for certain countries, I mean, because we can't look at the entire Western bloc as one foreign policy. This is actually something which is frustrating for us who try to kind of engage them, especially when it comes to Europe, because you have the European Union, but the European Union does not have a uniform foreign policy. Different countries have different foreign policies and different legacies, etc., in the region. But in my experience, in many cases, the fact that they thought we'd rather kind of get used to the dictators, a lot of it was more cynicism than a wish for stability. I think especially after 2013, 2014, the rise of ISIS, and then after that you had the rise of Mohammed bin Salman, and the instability that he created as well. War in Yemen, the boycott, basically the blockade of Qatar, the support, for example, for the strongman rule in Libya and in Egypt. It was clear by then. I think it's very clear, especially for people who I meet within foreign departments. It's very clear that they do not really buy anymore the idea that dictatorship brings the stability. Maybe this was a narrative that they had, certain people had maybe in 2013, but certainly I don't feel it. I don't find it at all in 2020. Maybe some of them do. Maybe they just don't. They don't say that to me when they meet me. But at least now, I feel that it's not really support rather than cynicism. What I mean by cynicism is this idea that You know what? Let's talk about Mohammed bin Salman, for example. Let's say we're talking about Saudi Arabia, because eventually you're not going to talk about the entire region. You're going to be talking about individual countries. That's another complicating factor here. So when you say, for example, why do you sell weapons, for example, to Saudi Arabia, or why do you maintain trade relations with Saudi Arabia when you see that this person is up to no good? And sometimes the answer is more like, it's not like, he's going to bring stability, because I think you'd be crazy to say that actually those dictators bring stability. I think no serious person at this point in 2020 is going to say that dictatorship still brings stability. Rather, what they say is, he's the king, he's about to be king, his crown prince going to be king, and if he's going to be king, he's going to be king for 20 years, and he doesn't seem to be any serious opposition to him. So, we can't really, check out from the region for 20 years. So we might as well engage. So it's really born more of cynicism about any change happening. And really, there's also this almost crisis in foreign policy thinking, because they don't know, like, basically, there was like two options before, two extremes, let's say. One of them is, let's engage bad regimes. Like, let's say that there's a regime which is bad, terrible, for example. Even we're talking, for example, Iranian regime, for example. Terrible human rights record, etc., problematic foreign policy. But there is this school of thinking that says, let's engage them, let's trade with them, because if we engage with them, we will have some leverage. And then if we have some leverage, we'll be able to push for some kind of reform. And then there's the other school of thinking, which is, let's isolate them and let's even pressure them, and maybe even let's actually pressure them militarily and even maybe invade. And both of these have crisis. Both of them are problematic, because if you engage dictators, you actually legitimize them, and sometimes you actually make them worse. And a lot of the time, when you actually invade them, etc., you also, Iraq War, for example, is a good example. You don't get a better outcome that way either. So I think this idea that Western nations or Western governments have willingly chosen the dictators for the sake of stability, I don't think that's valid anymore. It may have been valid in 2013, but I don't think it's valid anymore. But then let's get back to the second point, which is that Islamism is inevitable. Again, this is not really born by recent experience in the region, because when you look, for example, at let's look at the last 5 years rather than 2013. So it's true. Even if you look at the Muslim Brotherhood rule in Egypt, so Mursi won, and of course, in 2012 I was actually tabulating. I was very much involved in doing kind of civil society observation to the electoral process. So I actually put together a team. We were tabulating the vote count as it comes, etc. And I remember that in the first round of elections, I forgot, but basically the person who was running against Mursi was basically the last prime minister hired by Mubarak. He was basically a regime figure, Shafi. His name is Shafi. They were, they kind of they went past the first round to the second round. But let's look at the first round first of all, so just to see how true is it, this narrative that Islamic rule or Islamist rule is inevitable. In the first round, there were 5 candidates who received more than 10% of the vote. Out of these, of course, there was 2 Islamists, being Mursi and Abu al-Futuh. Abu al-Futuh was an ex-Muslim Brotherhood figure who had left the Muslim Brotherhood early in the uprising. So I think as early as January or February, he left the Muslim Brotherhood and he formed his own party. And he was considered more centrist rather than Islamist at the time. His coalition included even people who did not consider themselves Islamists. And then you had figures who were considered to be more non-Islamist but revolutionary, such as again I forgot the names. It's such a long time ago, and I think a lot of these people are no longer politically active and not even politically relevant anymore. And then you had certain figures who represented the old regime, and one of them, of course, was Shafi. And the person who got the most out of them, of course, was basically the Muslim Brotherhood candidate was Mursi and also Shafi. I think they both got above 20%. But then you had 5 candidates who got more than 10%. So the vote was not exactly crushingly pro-Mursi. It was more distributed among 5 candidates who represented different visions. And when you counted the vote share, like if you said, okay, out of those 5 candidates, how does the proportion go? It almost goes third, third, third. Almost like 1/3 were voting for someone who had an Islamic or Islamist background, and 1/3 were pro, someone who represented the old regime, and 1/3 were kind of like non-Islamist, but also pro-revolution kind of opposition. And so it was only by virtue of first past the post, which we can get back into it, but I think electoral systems. As far as electoral systems go, I think first past the post is a pretty terrible system to use in a highly partisan, highly polarized society. It actually makes it even more polarized. And unfortunately, this is what happened in Egypt. So I guess what I'm saying is that if we did not have first past the post, if we had some other kind of electoral system, such as preferential vote, for example, where you don't only say I want this person, and you don't have runoff elections, but rather you say you rank which candidate you want, in order. I think we wouldn't have had Morsi win. Maybe someone who's more centrist, such as Abdel Fattah, would have won. And of course, we can argue that Abdel Fattah has also had an Islamist background, but again, at the time he really represented something that's more centrist rather than Islamist. So I don't think that, the narrative was employed eventually that says that the Muslim Brotherhood winning the election proved that anytime you have elections in this region, you're going to have Muslim Brotherhood type government. And of course, the dictators and also the neo-colonialists used this to say that we cannot give these people democracy, because if we have democracy, we're going to have Muslim Brotherhood rule. And again, we can get back into what is Muslim Brotherhood rule, because again, the Muslim Brotherhood rule, like in a sense, the Tunisian Nahda party are also have Muslim Brotherhood roots, but they represent a very different political vision. And so, like, even the word, even when we say Muslim Brotherhood rule, I think we have to kind of unpack that and kind of say what do we even mean by that. But then, if you go back, again, you look at, for example, Libya, where you have we had they had free and fair elections, at least I think this was 2012. After the ousting of Gaddafi. I don't remember the dates exactly. Of course, this is before the civil war really got really bad, and the Islamists did not really win a landslide. They won some. The Muslim Brotherhood party did not really win by a landslide. They got, of course, a sizable number of seats, but they did not really win by a landslide. The same kind of goes in Sudan, because Sudan, you had an actual Islam, like the Omar al-Bashir actually employed. He ruled as an Islamist party leader, at least for a while. Of course, he fell out of favor with his own party, and eventually he ruled as an absolute dictator. Again, this was interesting because in Sudan you have an uprising by a majority Muslim population against someone who ruled in the name of an Islamic narrative. The same kind of happens in Iraq, because Iraq, again, is ruled by a coalition of different Islamist parties, of course, a lot of them being Shia Islamists. So I don't really believe that this narrative that says that if we give them democracy, or if we allow them democracy, then it's going to be inevitably a Muslim Brotherhood type situation. I don't think that's true. I do believe, of course, that Islam continues and will continue to be the cultural language and even the political language, part of the political language of the region. This is a fact. We are a majority Muslim population. This is a fact. But I don't think. They have changed the narrative to make it sound like if you have elections anywhere in this region, it's going to be Muslim Brotherhood. And I think that's simply not true.
Well, that leads to a question really about Egypt and what went wrong in Egypt for Mursi. So the narrative is that Mursi represented an overtly Islamic group, and it tried to change the constitution, and it attempted to apply a modest range of Islamic policies upon the populace. And within a year, the deep state, the remnants of the old regime, they worked to undermine Mursi and remove him from government with the tacit approval, I suppose, of, as you said, Saudi Arabia and UAE, who were more than happy to support General Sisi, but also the Americans, who were alarmed by the Islamist roots of the current Egyptian government, and worked with the regimes of Saudi Arabia and UAE to undermine Mursi's gains, and to replace him with in effect an authoritarian government. I mean, to what extent do you accept that narrative?
Well, initially, let me go back to 2011, because really the first split in the opposition, and I remember, in earlier in our conversation, we came to this point about, what do you need to actually push away at an entrenched system of oppression? And I said you need to build as big a coalition as possible. Building a coalition is very important here, because if you want to push against something that's a really deeply entrenched system, everyone has to push in the same direction. And if there's a split in the opposition, then it's going to create a situation where these very deeply entrenched systems that have had power for a very long time, and they have the guns, they have the weapons, they have the international relations, and they have all the money, and they run the economy. It's easy for them to push back if they find an opening. And for that reason, I was critical of the Muslim Brotherhood's early role, especially right after the fall of Mubarak. So if you remember, I mean, I mentioned that Abdul Men'am Abu Futuh, who was one of the presidential candidates, and he again came from a Muslim Brotherhood background, and he eventually quitted. He resigned his position as a Muslim Brotherhood member, and he formed his own party. He was of the position that the Muslim Brotherhood should not overtly enter politics. The reason being that we have to build as big a coalition as possible, and whether it is fair or not, whether it could be entirely unfair, but it's a fact that during the latter years of the Mubarak era, one of the most important things that Mubarak did, one of the most important tactics that he had, was to paint the opposition as Islamic extremists, and paint the Muslim Brotherhood as basically he has to, 10% of the population of Egypt, probably more than 10%, are Christians, and so part of the narrative he employed was, you cannot trust these guys, and these guys are going to they're going to build another tyranny, and they're going to oppress Christians, and they're going to oppress women, etc. So he created this narrative that, of course, if you're in the opposition and you don't really have a lot of power, you really can't push back against a government which controls everything. I personally was in the position that, once Mubarak is gone, and once the people have the power to decide who gets to rule next, I thought that the Muslim Brotherhood should actually not enter politics, and should say, we have done our role. Our role was to give this country political agency, and we're going to continue to be a strong social institution. We're going to continue to do our work, whether it is da'wah, whether it is social work, whether it is intellectual work, but we are not going to actually enter politics directly. I think that would have been a better choice for the Muslim Brotherhood, mainly because, for these two reasons. I guess for the first reason is, you don't want to create a split in the opposition. You want to build a big coalition in order to push together to make sure that the deep state, as you mentioned it, as you called it, actually recedes, is pushed back. But also, I guess, not to create a partisan situation where it's really, instead of being everybody pushing together to make sure that we actually have a successful transition where these people, this nation, is going to have political agency, rather it becomes a fight over who has power. And the moment that happens, and the moment people who are supposed to be allies become enemies, everything really heads south. So what happened really over 2012, especially, and I remember when I go back and I read the stuff that I was writing, and especially in late 2012, I was extremely pessimistic. I was pessimistic, especially at the rising partisanship and the polarization that was really, 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 disturbing and really painful, because I had friends on both sides, and I could see that, people were starting to really hate each other. And I'm like, this cannot end well. I mean, when the citizens in the country hate their own brothers and sisters this much, this creates a situation where the dictators can strike so easily, and this is exactly what happened, because they created a situation where earlier I told you, like, in the first round of the elections you had three camps, right? You had like non-Islamist opposition who are also pro-revolution, you had the Islamist pro-revolution camp, and you had the pro-government camp. And it's kind of like, it's not exactly 1/3 to 1/3, but it was like, if you count the shares, it's not exactly scientific, but it's kind of like you say that there are three forces in here. So long the non-Islamist opposition and the Islamist opposition were pushing together, they were getting results. But the moment that camp fell up against each other and the polarization became so deep, that's when the counter-revolutionary axis had the opportunity to strike. So I guess my criticism really was not so much for the policies. I mean, we can get back to the policies, but really they didn't really have a lot of policies, the Muslim Brotherhood. And it is true that they had, they were constantly thwarted by the quote-unquote deep state. But I guess my main criticism for them is that they did not try to build bridges. They did not try to basically unite this opposition. Especially if I guess a lot of people don't remember that era, but because we were plugged into the space, and I was listening to like Egyptian radio and TV shows, and I was listening to the narrative coming from both sides, and even the pro-Muslim Brotherhood figures were extremely polarizing. They were very, very polarizing, and that really, like, it was a depressing period of time, late 2012, early 2013. We knew that this is going to end badly. But before I hand it over to you, and I know you might have a follow-up, the U.S. role is not exactly clean over here. In other words, it's not so much. I mean, there are several books that were written about this that kind of explored what exactly was the U.S. role over here. The U.S. really was not so much anti-Muslim Brotherhood or even pro-Sisi, as much as it's simply like the Obama administration really was simply tired of the region. Obama wanted to pull back, and he wanted, like, he came to power with a promise that he wants to bring back the troops from the Iraq War. He didn't want any foreign entanglements, and so initially, when the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia started their plan, and I think the way that you described it is that the deep state kind of moved, and there was tacit approval from the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia. I think that the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia had more agency than we think. They were not simply tacitly approving. I think they actually were very much part of the whole conspiracy here. And we can see that they continue to play a very important role in kind of reshaping the region, etc., which we'll probably come back to. I don't think the United States, the worst thing the United States did here was really supporting them, but rather not curbing them. I mean, they could have stopped them. They could have said, this is a red line, we're not allowing you to do this, but they did not do that. And when events happened and there was a coup in Egypt, I don't think the coup itself was US approved, but rather the United States went along with it. Rather than push back, they kind of went along with it. And eventually they kind of late 2013, if you remember, there was also this whole thing about, let's have a deal with Iran, which is why they also did not, even though there was this, chemical weapons massacre. So there was 1 week, right? You had the Rabaa massacre in Egypt, and then 1 week later, exactly 7 days later, I think, there was the chemical weapons massacre in Syria. And I think these two events, very bloody events and very traumatic events, were read by the West, especially by the United States, as saying, this is a useless region. We don't want to get involved here. Let's just let them do what they want to do, and let's just pull back. So I think the U.S. role was not really pushing in the direction of autocracy, but rather not pushing enough in the opposite direction and being cynical and saying, you know what, throwing their hands in the air and saying, you know, we're not going to get involved in this.
Well, let's then move on to Syria, and of course, Syria is a very miserable episode actually in the history of the Arab Spring over the last decade, and we've seen what was initially a very optimistic revolution turn into something quite distasteful, and as you said at the very beginning, Syria today remains and is a failed state in many ways, and large parts of Syria is now a wasteland, and many Syrians, many millions of Syrians are refugees, either internally displaced in their country, or are now in Europe and the surrounding region. What went wrong in your mind in Syria?
So, I mean, before we get to Syria, I guess I want to take a look at Libya, because there's an important comparison to be made here. So, very early in the Arab Spring, the narrative that existed around the region, within the region, I'm talking like I lived within the region, and I had only lived within the region until this point. The overwhelming narrative was that these dictators are here to stay, and that these dictators can never be removed except by violence. I certainly believed it, and even people in the West believed it, and a lot of people within the region believed it. And this is why, of course, this created certain dynamics that benefited Islamist militant groups, because Islamist militant groups were kind of saying, we are waging a jihad, and we have to wage a jihad. It has to be military, because only violence can remove dictators that are this entrenched. And certainly, as I said, a lot of people actually believe, even people who opposed Islamist militants also believed that violence is the only way. There's no way that these regimes can just can just fall on their own. You need to actually employ violence to remove them. And so when the uprising in Tunisia succeeded, it was a great shock to the psyche, a psychological shock to 400 million Arabic-speaking citizens across the region. It was an absolute shock. It's like we really never imagined that simply people non-violently taking to the streets can actually remove one of those really, really deeply entrenched dictators. It was a shock. I have my own background. I mean, after the Iraq war, I was kind of radicalized. So there was actually a period of time in which I actually believed in Salafi jihadism. But I had maintained, in my reading diet, you can say that, I still would I would know which forums and which websites to see, to go to gauge the reactions of people who still believe in this militant narrative, which basically is saying that violence is the only way. And that confusion was also there. They were also very, very confused. When this happened again in Egypt, and then it rolled across, and you see the entire region erupt in uprisings, and these uprisings are actually getting somewhere, this created a serious crisis in the jihadist narrative. And if you remember, in May of 2011, that's also when Osama bin Laden was assassinated by the United States. So this was an extreme shock over there, because suddenly, these militant groups are saying violence is the only way, violence is the only way, violence is the only way. And as much as they try to employ violence, the dictators are getting stronger and stronger. And they're getting more and more support from the world. And the violence has become basically like, in order to actually hurt the regime, you have to fight foot soldiers who, a lot of them, in many cases are employees, basically, employees of the dictator. So you're hurting the dictator themselves. It becomes simply a civil war. So I want to set this up basically for the war of ideas, about the whole idea of violence. And then I want to point to Libya. The Libyan uprising, of course, happens in February of 2011. And very quickly, this uprising, it starts as non-violent protests, etc., but very quickly it becomes militarized. The reason why I think this is significant for us to understand Libya, because if we want to look at Syria, is because in Libya there was an intervention. There was an international intervention. There was a NATO intervention. That initially, of course, the mandate of the intervention was to prevent Gaddafi from committing, a massacre in Benghazi. And I remember it very, very, very closely because I was very much involved with, people on the ground, and I was very, very much concerned for friends that I had in Benghazi, and really, I was thinking, maybe this is the last day I hear from them. And there was one of them actually who was shot dead the first day, named Mohammed Nabous. I think a lot of Libyans would recognize the name. But what's interesting here is that I always wondered, what if there was no intervention in Libya? What if, because again, Libya very quickly became a civil war, and it became one party versus another party, and it became one party which is like Gaddafi, pro-Gaddafi, and the other party which is basically anti-Gaddafi. And very quickly we were kind of drawing maps of Libya, saying zones of control, etc. So it's kind of reminiscent of what happened in Syria later. I believe that if there was no intervention in Libya, we would have had a Syria-like situation in Libya. In other words, people who were supportive of the status quo would have supported Gaddafi with weapons and with ammunition and with logistical support, etc. While the people who are pro changing the status quo would have supported the other sides, and we would have kind of like a Syria-like situation in Libya, and a proxy war in Libya. And unfortunately, this is actually eventually what happened with Haftar. It happened much later, though. Reason why I'm pointing to this is because in a certain sense, something like the Syria theater was kind of inevitable. And I remember in 2012 when we were like doing kind of workshopping potential what might happen in Syria. I think I created a decision tree in March of 2012, thinking what are the options, what's going to happen in this country. And eventually it forked to different options, and all of the options really were terrible, because we knew that more and more forces are going to enter this theater. They're going to either support Assad or support the opposition to Assad. This is going to become increasingly militarized, and because of the vacuum in the region, that's going to create a situation where terror groups such as ISIS can exploit the situation, because there's large areas of the country that were outside of any control, and eventually we're going to have a split country, and this is unfortunately what happened. If we go back to why this happened, I think a lot of the people would, a lot of the narratives employed were kind of like, were the Syrians ready to rise? I think that's the wrong answer, the wrong question. I think the right question is, was the world ready? Was the world ready for Syrians to rise? Because the world at the time did not have any mechanisms to support such an uprising. We didn't really, even the world did not have the right framework to think of something that did not really imagine happening, which is a grand popular uprising, a groundswell of support against someone who was as entrenched as Assad. And we know that Assad ruled by force, his father ruled by force, it's extremely brutal regime, and we know that they would not do anything to stay in power. And so the more this became sectarianized, it became militant, it became really about one sect versus another sect. Assad had a lot of tools at his disposal. He had certain kind of exploitation relationships with Islamic groups going back to the Iraq War. For example, in 2004, between 2004, I believe, until 2007 or so, a lot of the Islamist extremists who were crossing the border into Iraq and fighting the United States in Iraq were doing so with full collaboration with Assad. A lot has been written about this. So he had kind of an exploitation. He was able to exploit the fact that he had a lot of militants locked up in prison, and he was able to turn this uprising from an uprising against him to a sectarianized kind of situation where he kind of like was able to create a situation where groups such as ISIS are going to rise, because he knew that if he creates a situation of me versus ISIS, the world is going to say, you know what, would rather not have an ISIS, and maybe we will tacitly support you. And this is exactly what happened.
I mean, let me pick up on that point you make about the Syrian revolution. I mean, do you think the Syrian demonstrators, the civil society actors that initially began the protests, do you think they were naive to accept the conflict to become an asymmetric military conflict?
I think there's a fundamental, there's one thing that we need to look at, I think, which is the depth of institutionalization of each regime. So you mentioned, for example, the deep state in Egypt. And I think this is actually an important concept to look at. There are certain regimes which have an institutionalization structure or an institutionalization level which allows the regime itself. In other words, the regime is bigger than the dictator himself. And so the regime can survive even if the dictator is removed, because the keys to power are still held by, like in Egypt, it's the army establishment. We've seen the situation in Tunisia, for example, where Ben Ali was removed, but the country did not fall apart. Mubarak, again, Mubarak was removed, the country did not fall apart. On the other hand, when you look at Libya, when Gaddafi was removed, the country absolutely fell apart. So there's differing levels of institutionalization there. Some dictators have been very paranoid, and they collected power, they centralized power to such a degree that, you know, once you remove them, you create a situation where nobody's in charge. Absolutely nobody's in charge. This was the case in Libya, definitely, and this is why Libya descended into this kind of situation very quickly. But this was also the situation in Syria. And, you know, if you remember in Syria in the early days, when Assad forces were kind of kicked out of a lot of Syria, the people of the villages had to actually run their cities on their own. They even had to, you know, run the schools and run the police stations and run the fire stations, and, you know, create their own governance structures, etc. Because in one swoop, the whole governance structure kind of just fell apart. So I think it's not just a matter of looking at what the protesters should have done or should not have done. It's also looking at the nature of the regime. And this is a conversation that was very much alive in 2011 and 2012. It's true that the Arab Spring encompassed so many different countries, up to 20 countries. But I think it's important to remember that each country has its very unique history, very unique regime, very unique, struggle. So I think one of the keys to understanding what happened in Syria is really the nature of the regime itself. The nature of the regime, the kind of the degree of centralization and corruption of that regime, and the fact that the regime, once it was gone, there was an absolute vacuum. Of course, you know, you look at the situation, there's pros and cons, because, you know, in the case of Egypt and in the case of Tunisia, you didn't have such a complete breakdown in public services. You know, someone else is running the show. But then there's a bad side to this, which is that, they continue to be, to be playing spoilers behind the scenes, which is what the army establishment continued to do under Mursi, and then, you know, coming back and ruling in the face, you know, and putting forward the face of Sisi. But then in Tunisia, you have a different situation where, you know, like they actually said, you know, they made the choice that we don't want to. We're not going to sacrifice the country for the sake of Ben Ali, and they basically said, you know, Ben Ali, you can leave, and they decided to stand aside and allow a democratic transition to proceed. We have kind of a situation like this arising in Saudi Arabia, where Saudi Arabia basically was like the power basically was the ruling family, and you have MBS consolidating power to such a degree that Saudi Arabia is actually becoming so centralized that this might be becoming a fragile regime now. But you know, not to stray too much away from the point, but I think definitely, you know, any kind of tactic, whatever the strategy or the tactic would have been in Syria, it still would have been very difficult. But again, I say it was not inevitable, because once Assad decided that he's going to wage war and he's going to ensure that this is going to be a war, because he does not want to face his people on the streets when they are protesting. He wants it to be a war because, they want to make it about war because they have a lot of guns. They have, like, it's kind of like a situation where if you want to face an enemy, it's always better for you to face the enemy when on a ground where you have the upper hand, and avoid facing the enemy on a ground where they have the upper hand. So the whole idea of when we say that we want non-violent struggle is really, it's about strategy in the end. Because if we make it violent, they have a lot more guns than us. And, there's no way that we're going to win if it's violent, because they simply have, they have armies, we don't. Which is why we say that, it should be non-violent, because there's enormous strategic benefits to this. You're forcing your adversary over here into a ground that they have a disadvantage in. So it's logical for Assad, from a strategic point of view, to want to make it about violence, because if he makes it about violence, he has the upper hand. I believe at that point, especially when he started bombing cities and he started dropping barrel bombs and he started, it became an absolute slaughterhouse. The world should have intervened. I mean, if the world was serious about human rights, it was serious about the values that it claimed to have. Unfortunately, of course, it turns out to be an extremely hypocritical world. But if they were serious about this, they would have at least implemented some kind of no-fly zone. I mean, no one in the opposition at the time was actually asking for a military intervention. They were not saying that we want you to send troops in. What they were saying is stop, take measures to prevent Assad from using his air force, and we will do the rest of the job. We will take care of the rest. Simply stop him from using his air force to bomb our cities. It was important because it was also a matter of proving that Syrians can govern themselves, and they were actually trying to govern themselves. Unfortunately, that did not happen, and of course, the rest is history. And it's a sad tragedy, but also it was extremely damaging to the world order. You have the rise of ISIS, you have the rise of the refugee, a refugee wave after the other. You have enormous human suffering, and you have this vacuum that was exploited by several actors, of course, by ISIS, by Putin, by the Iranian regime and its militias, etc. So it's not really. I don't point the finger at the Syrians. They did the best they could. I point the fingers really at the very hypocritical world order.
Now let's talk about the future, Iyad. We've seen a decade of chaos in the Arab world, and as you quite rightly say, this decade is the start of something, and this transition to a better place, to an end to these dictatorships is yet to reach its natural fruition. I wonder, from your perspective, we've already discussed the role of Islamic groups in the current politics of the region. But what role do you see of Islamic parties and Islamic groups in the years ahead in not only developing the course of the Arab Spring, but also ultimately in the type of political makeup that the Arab world comes to?
So I would borrow something that my late friend Jamal Khashoggi said. If we don't accept Islamist parties, then we cannot have democracy. It's simply as that. Either we have a political system that includes everybody and does not exclude anybody, or we have dictatorship where everybody is under some boot or another. It is simply not possible to have any kind of legitimate democratic system in this region without accepting Islamist parties into the body politic. This, of course, does not mean that, again, I don't believe that they're actually inevitably will win elections. What will happen really is that we will have a situation where multiple Islamic parties are competing with other parties which might be socialist or non-Islamist or liberal or nationalist, etc., whatever it is. So I don't believe it's not possible to actually have a democracy if you exclude someone from democracy. It's against the very concept of democracy. when it comes to, I mean, your point about liberal parties in Syria and Egypt, I'll just give you my own, my own observation. The first is that there are very few true liberals in Egypt. A lot of the people who are kind of like, were described in Western media as liberal were not actually that liberal. They were simply non-Islamists or anti-Islamists. A lot of them were simply nationalists, like basically army establishment, maybe not pro Mursi, sorry, not pro Mubarak, but pro Sisi. And to understand this, really, you have to understand the history of Egypt. Egypt used to be really the center of the region. It used to be one of the most important, really the leading Arab country for a long time. Under Nasser and under for a certain extent until the 1970s. It seemed like Egypt was the center of the world at the time, of this world, of this, of its region. And it was really, it fell under a very humiliating period, starting from the 1970s, maybe even the late 60s. And so, this does something to your identity. If you're an Egyptian, you kind of remember that my country was great. My country was a leader. And this never really goes away. And you kind of like you say, I want that leader who's going to make my country great again. And I want this leader who's going to be decisive and is going to be strong and is going to be. And I'm sure that you understand this. This is kind of the same. You see the same thing with the United States, with make America great again, etc. So in a sense, I guess I'm trying to do kind of more of a psychological rather than a political analysis. But sometimes, I'm actually convinced that we need to read countries on their own terms. So sometimes, even if we say this is good or this is bad, sometimes it's not enough to simply say this is good or bad, but we kind of like have to probe and say, where is this coming from? So I mean, because once you actually if you actually take the values of a lot of these people, you find that actually they're simply nationalists, sometimes even chauvinistic nationalists, really. And sometimes they adopt liberal narratives, sometimes nationalists, sometimes socialist, and sometimes even Islamic, really. But in the end, it's really, the psychology is really pushing in one direction in the end. In Syria, it is true that Islamic parties played a role. I don't really say parties. It was more like, so for example, one of the earliest and most important non-violent activists in Duma, a man called Ghayaf Matar. And he was a religious Muslim, and he believed in a very unique vision for Islam. I mean, he was, you could probably Google him and know more about him. Of course, he was eventually arrested and tortured to death by Assad. And he believed, in a non-violent Islamic narrative. He was not a partisan. He was not Muslim Brotherhood, etc. But basically, he believed, the values that inspired him were Islamic values. And I think this is important because when we talk about Islamic, I think it's important to acknowledge that this is a wide spectrum. It's a very wide spectrum. It cannot be reduced to only one party, be it the Muslim Brotherhood or any other. There are many different. This is a region where Islam is the majority. Is the majority population. The people of the region will always be looking forward to Islam to justify whatever it is, that they believe in, whether it is good or whether it is bad. I mean, like I said, Islam is always going to be the language, the cultural language of the region. But it's very difficult to map this onto political in political terms because whenever you have a dictatorships almost obsessively remove kind of like they empty the political scene from any dissidents, any opposition figures. And so at the start of the Arab Spring in 2011, the political scene in both Egypt and Syria were really emaciated. I mean, they were really eviscerated. You can't really talk of political parties back then. You could talk of individual people, like there were lots of socialists, for example, who were part of the initial uprising. Some of them continue to be significant and influential intellectually, at least until now. But you can't really map this ideologically Um, and I think I'm sure that we'll come back to the reason in a bit, because I've studied your questions, and there is a bit to speak about the role of ideology here, because I think that it's premature to speak about ideology when people don't even have political agency.
How about if people call for political agency through ideology? And so, if the if the masses in a country, in the case of Syria, fine, it's now a it's a failed state in many ways, and the writ of the Assad regime has returned to the country. But even Syria, if we were to argue that the Arab Spring has just begun, and the process of removing the tyrants is an ongoing process, then what would be wrong for Muslim groups to aspire for change based on Islamic polity, and very explicitly state that they want to rejuvenate an Islamic narrative, an Islamic version of history, which very openly calls for Sharia rule, but at the same time it's a tolerant state, and it accepts, like much of the Islamic history accepts different religious denominations to live peacefully in a under that government, and it accepts not to create this sectarian divisions and divisiveness that comes from much of the democratic models that we see foisted upon the Muslim world. How would you respond to if there was a genuine grassroots movement that called for an expression of Islam which certainly wasn't ISIS?
So I'll only let me go over my own experience, because I lived this kind of year by year and month by month. Very early in the Arab Spring, and this was March of 2011. This is what I thought. I thought, now that we have an actual democratic transition, we need to start talking about ideology. And in fact, one of my early projects was called the Arab Spring Manifesto, and this is where I wanted to write a book in which I explore what I call Islamic libertarianism, which was kind of my own reading for kind of like what you described. It was kind of imagining what a system that implements Islamic values would look like in the 21st century. And we were employing, it was like basically me and a couple of people who are kind of working on this, and we're kind of looking at historical precedent. We're looking at rational arguments. We're looking at even Western arguments. Comparing this, even like comparing and contrasting, sometimes positively and sometimes negatively, with Western models, saying, this is where, this might be a topic that Western models got right, and this is a topic that maybe they got wrong. And really trying to, a lot of it were really raising questions rather than giving answers, and saying that this maybe sometimes the question is more important than the answer. This was my understanding for my work very early on. And when I go back and read a lot of what I was writing in 2011, 2012, it was really revolving around this, the need for a manifesto, and a need for kind of like, really, we have to start talking ideology now. Later events convinced me that it was premature. The reason why is because I think that there are three problems that need to be worked out one after the other. The first layer that we need to, the first problem we need to solve is what I call the dignity problem. The dignity problem really is about the people accepting and understanding that they actually have political agency, that they deserve better, that they deserve not to live under corruption and tyranny and repression, and they need to get up and stand up. And this is the first problem that needs to be solved. You cannot really talk to people about final solutions and how the government is going to look, etc., if they don't even believe in their own dignity. If they don't even believe that they deserve to work for something, they don't deserve anything better than what exists. So that's the first problem that I see. I mean, the first problem that we need to solve is the dignity problem. And you see that in the narratives that I employ right now, I mean, the current, 2018, 2019, 2020, I use the word dignity a lot because this is, again, this is the fundamental problem that needs to be solved, is a dignity problem. In some countries, you see that people actually have risen up. And so the dignity, at that point, we say the dignity narrative has borne fruits, and then we can get to the second layer. And the second layer, I believe, is the political agency problem. We cannot be talking about final solutions, ideologies, political parties, manifestos, etc., if the people don't even have political agency. They don't even have the right to vote. Because eventually, whatever ideology it is, it will have to be implemented within a framework where people can exchange in a free exchange of ideas. They can engage with ideas. They can assess ideas, etc. So if we don't get to the point where people can actually form political parties, have political agendas, vote for representatives, form party platforms, create political ideologies, and try to debate it with the people, etc., we won't even get to that point. So it's only after we solve the political agency problem, that's when we start talking about political manifestos and political ideologies, etc. And it has to be within a framework of where we say, we agree that whoever gets the most consent from this population he's going to be able to implement his agenda so long the people agree that he continues his agenda. So I'm not exactly against this idea that we have to be talking about ideology. I simply, I'm talking my own experience. From my own experience, it's premature to talk about it when you're kind of putting the cart before the horse. And there are certain disadvantages to doing that. I mean, sometimes it can be damaging, especially when you need to create, like, going back to the whole situation with Egypt, you need to create a very wide coalition. And you need to root yourself in values, and you need to actually say to your comrades who might not believe in the same thing that you believe in, but they believe in political agency and they believe in dignity. You cannot split the opposition at that point and say, no, I want to implement my political vision, and if you don't believe in my political vision, then I'm not going to ally with you. Then you're not going to get to the point of political agency, and you're going to create a situation where the dictators are always pushing you back. So this is my perspective.
Yeah, I want to understand this point a bit further, because I'm not sure if there can be a genuine attempt to build political consensus without first developing some form of ideology, even if it's a very broad set of principles around which those activists in particular, but also those who decide that enough is enough, and they want to develop platforms against the regime. I wonder whether you can do that without first entertaining the discussion and debate about ideology. I mean, just think about your argument about Saudi Arabia is that the regime is fragile, and the more the MBS regime tries to gut out the different institutions of state, the more that regime ends up concentrating power, but it's at the expense of those institutions that allowed the state to govern. And so, if you don't have then a counterforce to that have in place a vision for how the state should be run, then you may actually end up with a political vacuum, which leads to its own problems and own consequences. I suppose my question really is, can you really have a political program without ideology? And if you suggest, I mean, there have been debates in the Muslim world now, or during the Arab Spring, about the need to establish a civil state. But from what I can see, that civil state sounds, has a very strong resemblance to a democratic liberal state or a liberal democratic state. And so to what extent, are we just calling for ideology, but in a, but pretending that there is something neutral that has been expressed here?
First of all, let me say, I don't see democracy I mean small d democracy, as in the very idea that people can vote and can select who rules them, and they can select, vote in, representatives, etc. I don't really believe it's an ideology, but rather the freedom to select an ideology. I mean, because you can talk about big D democracy, which has actually kind of like a very heavy investment in one model or the other. But you can also talk of a small D democracy, which is simply the idea that people are going to have political agency. They will be able to choose platforms. They will be able to, what do you say? Because what is the option? The other option is people don't get to choose. And that's basically simply tyranny. And that's basically going to set you up for a return. You know, the dictators can very simply mount a comeback at that point. So I don't really think it's an ideology, but rather the freedom of people to select one. Now, there have been many attempts to create Islamic platforms and Islamic manifestos over the years, and so far none of them have succeeded. And I think the reason is not just the partisanship matter, it's also that you need to create these platforms in dialectic with reality, which means that you are creating a plan not in the abstract, but actually to be implemented and with an actual realistic chance to implement it. So for example, if you were talking about this in Egypt in 2011 or 2012, it's not theoretical. It's not something that you're saying, you know, I'm going to implement it when I get power. How are you going to get power? I mean, Sisi is in power, like if you're talking now, for example. Rather, it'll be more like, you know, in 2012, 2011, it was like, I can actually implement this. If you vote for me, I can actually make this happen, and we can actually work on this. So there's a very big difference of you saying, I have a platform and I have you know, these ideas and I want to implement them, when you have a realistic chance of implementing them, because what that will do is that it will create a virtuous cycle, which means that you will actually have a dialectic, you will have debates, you will have, you know, more people who are interested to come forward with new ideas and new new perspectives, and you will be able to implement it in reality, and you will see what will succeed, what will fail. You can improve your ideology, improve your narrative. There's also the fact that, you know, society evolves, the world evolves, there's new technology coming up, there's new problems coming up, and you can improve that, you can include that into your party platform and into your ideology. This happens when you already have political agency. In other words, what I'm saying is that it is more successful. The chance for success for something like this is far more, it's far bigger when you already have political agency. On the other hand, when you actually create this and you kind of focus on this when you don't even have political agency. I mean, I'll give you an example from Saudi Arabia, because, you know, you brought up Saudi Arabia. In the 1990s, there was a number of prominent opposition figures who went into exile. You know, and they went mostly the more famous ones are in London right now, and they focused, I mean, and Saad al-Faqih, and they mostly focused on ideology. But then you look at them today. They mostly focus on ideology. They were very successful in you know, creating kind of a base even inside Saudi Arabia. But then you look at them right now, and the people who are actually getting the most the farthest, and they're getting the most done, are actually the new people on the scene, and they're people who are not really entrenched in ideology. They're really talking about you know, technocratic, really technocratic and value-based view rather than ideological view. And really, even though, like, for example, it includes people who come from a very deeply Islamic background, such as, for example, Abdullah al-Auda, who, as you know, is the son of Salman al-Auda, Sheikh Salman al-Auda. And, you know, in the orbit, you also have a lot of people who, what I consider post-Islamist, which are people who are basically using, they're very much believing Muslims, and they're very much believe in Islam, but they're employing, you know, they're basically employing an Islamic human rights-based or rights-based narrative rather than a legal-based narrative. And again, we don't know what this will lead into. I'm just saying that this is maybe an ideological transition or an ideological change. We don't know where it's going to lead, and we don't know what they're going to do if, you know, if they actually are in power. We maybe they don't have specific ideas yet. Again, because you know, the main problem to solve right now is really having political agency in the first place. And you see a situation where the people who focus too much on ideology ended up cocooning themselves in an ideological bubble. They ended up really not working a lot with other people who they should be working with in order to push together. and they ended up increasing partisanship and coming across as more interested in their political agendas than in the values, the general values that, this is about freedom, this is about, justice, this is about, dignity, etc. So I think it's not really about, I think it's very easy to create a platform based upon values and civil society and, kind of technocracy, saying that we're going to run this country in the best possible way, and then give the society, again, this Muslim society, a chance to heal and to transition and to choose what it wants, what direction it wants to go. Again, it's an interesting topic. I mean, I think there was an Islamic leader who very early in the Arab Spring wrote a book. And I remember the name. I don't remember his name, but I remember the name of the argument. It was called سيادة الأمة قبل تطبيق الشريعة, which in Arabic means the authority of the Ummah is more important or takes precedence chronologically. It comes before implementation of Sharia. I don't remember the person's name. I don't think he's someone I politically or religiously agree with. I think he's more of employing a Salafi narrative. But it's very important that the way he articulated it. He said it's more important for us to actually have political agency before we start talking about the details of implementation.
Iyad Baghdadi, one last question for you, and I know we've spoken for a very long time, and I ask the same question really at the end of my conversations with my guests about the Arab Spring. Are you hopeful about the future of the Arab and Muslim world?
I mean, when it comes to the question of hope, I think I make a distinction between hope and optimism. And this has come, of course, Brother Jalal, from a lot of personal experience. I mean, when you experience a lot of pain, a lot of personal pain, a lot of prison was horrible, and being in an airport and living in an airport because you have nowhere else to go and losing your country like that, it's also like a very traumatic experience. What happened to my family was also traumatic. Living in a refugee camp, etc. Being under protection right now because very powerful people want to kill me. All of that forces you to really come down and ask the really hard questions about what is most important for you in life. And I learned very quickly that there's a difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is kind of a general sense of saying, I think I'm going to have a positive outcome. Hope, on the other hand, is more like your ability to turn your compass in the right direction. It's more of knowing that something is worth fighting for. Whether or not you succeed in the end, whether or not you win, becomes less important. It's kind of like the distinction in Islam between al-rida, which is contentment, and al-farah, or happiness. The word farah, for example, in the Quran is used both in a positive way and in a negative way. Happiness or joy. It's used both in a positive and in a negative way. But rida, on the other hand, in our religious tradition in general, is used in a positive way. In other words, you can have rida, you can have basically contentment and gratitude in your heart, even when you're sad, even when you're angry, even when you're in pain. You can still have that contentment in your heart. And I think this is what I associate with hope. It's really the idea that some things are worth more than our lives. Some things are really worth it. And for this reason, I believe I continue to be hopeful. I mean, when you look back at even our religious tradition, and I find a lot of inspiration in our religious tradition. You find that there are religious movements and social movements and even prophets who came to this earth and they were persecuted. And in the end, they went alone, and nobody believed in them. And on the other hand, you have prophets who came and they had a lot of success. And this kind of, as Muslims living in a very turbulent time, we kind of look back and say, does this mean that the truth, the values of a movement depend upon its success or failure? I don't think so. I don't think it does. I think in the end, we have to simply say that we have to do, as human beings, we have to do the best we can. We have to align ourselves towards the right values. And then we have to leave the results to God in the end, because we are not in control. In the end, we are not in control. Even the dictators are not in control. They think that they're in control, but they're not. You know, in a sense, I mean, I look at the Corona pandemic, for example. I'm like, Subhanallah, the most powerful people in the world, and you have something as little as a virus basically turning the whole world upside down. And like, I don't think we would have been talking about, Trump losing the election and dictators losing a very important ally such as Trump, if we didn't have this, very tiny virus kind of infecting the world and, turning the world upside down. In the end, going back to your question, I think we simply have to align ourselves towards true north, towards these values. And we really have to leave the rest to the divine, really. I mean, we are not running the universe. We aren't. We're simply trying to do the best we can.
Brother Iyad El-Baghdadi, it's been fascinating speaking to you today, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala keep you safe and allow you to achieve success, and hopefully, inshallah ta'ala, we will speak sometime soon again.
Inshallah. Thank you so much, Allah.